Hegel's Phenomenology Spirit, Self-Consciousness, the Truth of Self-Certainty. In the previous modes of certainty, what is true for consciousness is something other than itself, but the notion of this truth vanishes in the experience of it. What the object immediately was in itself, mere being in sense certainty, the concrete thing of perception, and for the understanding, a force proves to be in truth, not this at all. Instead, this in itself turns out to be a mode in which the object is only for another. The notion of the object is superseded in the actual object, or the first immediate presentation of the object is superseded in experience. Certainty gives place to truth, but now there has arisen what did not emerge in these previous relationships, namely a certainty which is identical with its truth, for the certainty is to itself its own object, and consciousness is to itself the truth. In this, there is indeed an otherness, that is to say, consciousness makes a distinction, but one which at the same time is for consciousness not a distinction. If we give the name of notion to the movement of knowing, and the name of object to knowing, as a passive unity, or as the I, then we see that not only for us, but for knowing itself, the object corresponds to the notion, or alternatively, if we call notion what the object is in itself, but call the object what it is qua object, or for another, then it is clear that being in itself and being for another are one and the same. For the in itself is consciousness, but equally it is that for which another, the in itself, is, and it is for consciousness that the in itself of the object and the being of the object for another are one and the same. The I is the content of the connection and the connected itself. Opposed to another, the I is its own self, and at the same time it overarches this other, which, for the I, is equally only the I itself. With self-consciousness, then, we have therefore entered the native realm of truth. We have now to see how the shape of self-consciousness first makes its appearance. If we consider this new shape of knowing, the knowing of itself in relation to that which preceded, namely the knowing of another, then we see that though this other has indeed vanished, its moments have at the same time no less been preserved, and the loss consists in this, that here they are present as they are in themselves, the mere being of what is merely meant, the singleness and the universality opposed to it of perception, as also the empty inner being of the understanding. These are no longer essences, but are moments of self-consciousness, that is, abstractions or distinctions which at the same time have no reality for consciousness itself, and are purely vanishing essences. Thus it seems that only the principal moment itself has been lost, namely the simple self-subsistent existence for consciousness. But in point of fact, self-consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world, of sense and perception, and is essentially the return from otherness. As self-consciousness, it is movement, but since what it distinguishes from itself is only itself as itself, the difference as an otherness is immediately superseded for it. The difference is not and it, self-consciousness, is only the motionless tautology of I am I, but since for it the difference does not have the form of being, it is not self-consciousness. Hence otherness is for it in the form of a being, or as a distinct moment, but there is also for consciousness the unity of itself, with this difference as a second distinct moment. With that first moment, self-consciousness is in the form of consciousness, and the whole expanse of the sensuous world is preserved for it, but at the same time only as connected with the second moment, the unity of self-consciousness with itself, and hence the sensuous world is for it an enduring existence, which, however, is only appearance, or a difference which in itself is no difference. This antithesis of its appearance and its truth has, however, for its essence only the truth, namely the unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness, that is, self-consciousness is desire in general, consciousness as self-consciousness henceforth has a double object. One is the immediate object, that of sense certainty and perception, which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative, and the second, viz. Itself, which is the true essence and is present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object. In this sphere, self-consciousness exhibits itself as the movement in which the antithesis is removed, and the identity of itself with itself becomes explicit for it. But for us, or in itself, the object which for self-consciousness is the negative element, has on its side returned into itself, just as on the other side consciousness has done. Through this reflection into itself, the object has become life. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being also has in it, insofar as it is posited as being, not merely the character of sense certainty and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is a living thing, for the in itself or the universal result of the relation of the understanding to the inwardness of things is the distinguishing of what is not to be distinguished, or the unity of what is distinguished. But this unity is, as we have seen, just as much repulsed from itself, and this notion sunders itself into the antithesis of self-consciousness and life. The former is the unity for which the infinite unity of the differences is. The latter, however, is only this unity itself, so that it is not at the same time for itself. To the extent, then, that consciousness is independent, so too is its object, but only implicitly. Self-consciousness, which is simply for itself and directly characterizes its object as a negative element, or is primarily a desire, will therefore, on the contrary, learn through experience that the object is independent. The determination of life, as it has issued from the notion, or the general result with which we enter this sphere, insufficient to characterize it without having further to develop its nature, its sphere is completely determined in the following moments. Essence is infinity as the supersession of all distinctions, the pure movement of axial rotation, its self-repose being an absolutely restless infinity, independence itself, in which the differences of the movement are resolved, the simple essence of time, which is the equality with itself, has the stable shape of space. The difference, however, are just as much present as differences in this simple universal medium, for this universal flux has its negative nature only in being the supersession of them, but it cannot supersede the different moments if they do not have an enduring existence. It is this very flux, as the self-identical independence, which is itself an enduring existence, in which therefore they are present as distinct members and parts existing on their own account. Being no longer has the significance of abstract being, nor has their pure essentiality the significance of abstract universality. On the contrary, their being is precisely that simple fluid substance of pure movement within itself. The difference, however, qua difference of these members with respect to one another consists in general in no other determinateness than that of the moments of infinity or of the pure movement itself. The independent members are for themselves, but this being for self is really no less immediately their reflection into the unity than this unity is the splitting up into independent shapes. The unity is divided within itself because it is an absolutely negative or infinite unity, and because it is what subsists. The difference too has independence only in it. This independence of the shape appears as something determinate for another, for the shape is divided within itself, and the supersession of this dividedness accordingly takes place through another. But this supersession is just as much within the shape itself, for it is just that flux that is the substance of the independent shapes. This substance, however, is infinite, and hence the shape in its very subsistence is a dividedness within itself, or the supersession of its being for self. If we distinguish more exactly the moments contained here, we see that we have at the first moment the subsistence of the independent shapes, or the supersession, or the suppression of what dimension is in itself, namely that the shapes have no being in themselves, no enduring existence. The second moment, however, is the subjection of that existence to the infinity of the difference. In the first moment, there is the existent shape as being for itself, or being in its determinateness, infinite substance. It comes forward in antithesis to the universal substance, disowns this fluent continuity with it, and asserts that it is not dissolved in this universal element, but on the contrary preserves itself by separating itself from this its inorganic nature, and by consuming it. Life in the universal fluid medium, a passive separating out of the shapes, becomes, just as by so doing, a movement of those shapes, or becomes life as a process. The simple universal fluid medium is in itself, and the difference of the shapes is the other, but this fluid medium itself becomes the other through the difference, for now it is for the difference which exists in and for itself, and consequently is the ceaseless movement by which the passive medium is consumed. Life is life as a living thing. This inversion, however, is for that reason again an invertedness in its own self. What is consumed is the essence, the individuality which maintains itself at the expense of the universal, and which gives itself the feeling of its unity with itself. Just by so doing, supersedes its antithesis to the other by means of which it exists for itself. Its self-given unity with itself is just that fluidity of the difference, or their general dissolution. But conversely, the supersession of individual existence is equally the production of it, for since the essence of the individual shape, universal life, and what exists for itself is in itself simple substance, when this substance places the other within itself, it supersedes this, its simplicity or its essence, that is, it divides it, and the dividedness of the differenceless fluid medium is just what establishes individuality. Thus, the simple substance of life is the splitting up of itself into shapes, and at the same time the dissolution of these existent differences. And the dissolution of the splitting up is just as much a splitting up and a forming of members. With this, the two sides of the whole movement, which before were distinguished, namely the passive separateness of the shapes in the general medium of independence and the process of life, collapse into one another. The latter is just as much an imparting of shape as a supersession of it, and the other, the imparting of shape, is just as much a supersession as an articulation of shape. The fluid element is itself only the abstraction of essence, or it is actual only as shape, and its articulation of itself is again a splitting up of what is articulated into form, or a dissolution of it. It is the whole round of this activity that constitutes life, not what was expressed at the outset, the immediate continuity and compactness of its essence, nor the enduring form, the discrete moment existing for itself, nor the pure process of these, nor yet the simple taking together of these moments. Life consists rather in being the self-developing whole, which dissolves its development and in this movement simply preserves itself. Since we started from the first immediate unity and returned through the moments of formation and of process to the unity of both these moments, and thus back again to the original simple substance, this reflected unity is different from the first. Contrasted with that immediate unity, or that unity expressed as a mere being, this second is the universal unity which contains all these moments as superseded within itself. It is a simple genus which, in the movement of life itself, does not exist for itself qua this simple determination. On the contrary, in this result, life points to something other than itself, namely the consciousness, for which life exists as this unity, or as a genus. This other life, however, for which the genus as such exists, and which is genus on its own account, namely self-consciousness, exists in the first instance for self-consciousness only as the simple essence and has itself as pure I for object. In the course of its experience which we are now to consider, this abstract object will enrich itself for the I and undergo the unfolding which we have seen in the sphere of life. The simple I is this genus or the simple universal for which the differences are not differences only by its being the negative essence of the shaped independent moments, and self-consciousness is thus certain of itself only by superseding this other that presents itself to self-consciousness as an independent life. Self-consciousness is desire, certain of the nothingness of this other. It explicitly affirms that this nothingness is for it the truth of the other. It destroys the independent object and thereby gives itself the certainty of itself as a true certainty, a certainty which has become explicit for self-consciousness itself in an objective manner. In this satisfaction, however, experience makes it aware that the object has its own independence. Desire and the self-certainty obtained in its gratification are conditioned by the object, for self-certainty comes from superseding this other. In order that this supersession can take place, there must be this other. This self-consciousness by its negative relation to the object is unable to supersede it. It is really because of that relation that it produces the object again and the desire as well. It is in fact something that other than self-consciousness that is the essence of desire. And through this experience, self-consciousness has itself realized this truth, but at the same time it is no less absolutely for itself, and it is so only by superseding the object, and it must experience its satisfaction, for it is the truth. On account of the independence of the object, therefore, it can achieve satisfaction only when the object itself effects the negation within itself, and it must carry out this negation of itself in itself, for it is in itself the negative, and must be for the other what it is, since the object is in its own self-negation, and in being so is at the same time independent. It is consciousness in the sphere of life which is the object of desire. Negation is present either in an other, namely in desire, or as a determinateness opposed to another in different form, or as the inorganic universal nature of life. But this universal independent nature, in which negation is present as absolute negation, is the genus as such, or the genus as self-consciousness. Self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. The notion of self-consciousness is only completed in these three moments. A. The pure undifferentiated I is its first immediate object. B. But this immediacy is itself an absolute mediation. It is only as a supersession of the independent object. In other words, it is desire. The satisfaction of desire is, it is true, the reflection of self-consciousness into itself, or the certainty that has become truth. C. But the truth of this certainty is really a double reflection, the duplication of self-consciousness. Consciousness has for its object one which, of its own self, posits its otherness or difference as nothingness, and in so doing is independent. The differentiated, merely a living shape, does indeed also supersede its independence in the process of life, but it ceases with its distinctive difference to be what it is. The object of self-consciousness, however, is equally independent in this negativity of itself, and thus it is for itself a genus, a universal fluid element. In the peculiarity of its own separate being, it is a living self-consciousness. A self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is it in fact self-consciousness. for only in this way does the unity of itself in its otherness become explicit for it. The I, which is the object of its notion, is in fact not object. The object of desire, however, is only independent, for it is the universal, indestructible substance, the fluid, self-identical essence. A self-consciousness in being an object is just as much I as object. With this we already have before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which, in their opposition, enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I that is we, and we that is I. It is in self-consciousness, in the notion of spirit, that consciousness first finds its turning point, where it leaves behind it the colourful show of the sensuous here and now, and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond, and steps out into the spiritual daylight of the present. Where next indeed. Lordship in bondage, as it happens.